Okay, so welcome to the PharmEco webinar on the SSbD framework, so the Safe and Sustainable by Design framework, and its adaptation to the pharmaceutical sector. I'm Hannah Welsh, Research Associate at the Technical University of Berlin and co-lead of the work package on standardization and harmonization of sustainability assessment methodologies. And today, sharing their expertise with you and to join me are Nina Melander from Research Institutes of Sweden, and Caroline Moormond from the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and the Environment, the RIVM. So what we will do today is to look at the work done on SSbD that actually precedes the PharmEco project, but forms actually the basis or the foundation of what we will build on during the course of the project. So first of all, I'll give you a very brief introduction to the PharmEco project, and then Nina will take over to introduce you to the SSbD framework, and then Caroline will discuss the adaptation of the framework to pharmaceuticals and moving from the SSbD to the SSbC, which she will explain shortly. Then we will have time at the end for a short wrap-up and a few minutes for Q&A. But if anybody has any questions throughout the presentation, please post them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So to start with, the overarching project goal for PharmEco is to advance sustainable practices in pharmaceutical manufacturing of small molecules, biologics, and tides, and also of decontamination processes. We are an international consortium consisting of 31 public and industry partners, and this is coordinated by and led by the University of Ghent and of Sanofi, so in a tandem of public and industry partners. And we're a project that's co-funded by the EU and also of private members of the Innovative Health Initiative joint undertaking. So our main sort of expected outcomes are the enhanced manufacturing according to SSbD methods, and this consists of then reducing resource use, emissions, and overall improvement of environmental impact. We will develop and offer a public eco-design toolbox for the sector and also develop a standardized sustainability assessment methodology for the sector. So how we will achieve these objectives is here the structure of the project is actually key. So where we have essentially technical work packages centered around route design, synthesis platforms, decontamination, biomanufacturing, and also pilot manufacturing. And key or essential here is this work package on sustainability assessment and steering, in which the SSbD work will really take place and is embedded. So to keep it short and sweet, this is the context of today's presentation. And without further ado, I will hand over to Nina to introduce you to the framework.
Thank you, Hannah. So my name is Nina Melander and I work at the Swedish Substitution Center, which is a government initiative to support industry in phasing out hazardous chemicals that is hosted by RISE. I will discuss or present shortly development and the background of the Safe and Sustainable by Design framework, as well as the first version that was released by the Joint Research Center in 2022, and what it seems like the new version and the differences with the 2025 framework it seems to be. But first, I would like to kind of zoom out a bit and look at the big perspective of why this SSbD framework has been developed and what it's supposed to be used for. And a simple way to describe this would be that it's a voluntary approach for innovators to address the planetary triple crisis directly in the choices and designs made for chemicals, materials, products, and processes, where you bring out data and look at how these decisions impact climate change, biodiversity loss that's driven by resource use, and pollution, especially chemical pollution. But taking it down a notch on a more practical level, SSbD is really about identifying and moving away from the most hazardous chemicals or resource-intensive raw materials as early innovation as suitable. And it's a way to really reduce business and regulatory risk. The framework also encourages to gather more comprehensive data to make more informed decisions for safety and sustainability and reduce uncertainty in this dimension to understand what is safe and appropriate for specific applications. And this is really a way of avoiding regrettable chemicals and materials when we are trying to replace things in the name and in the green transition. So it means to avoid that we are replacing or substituting chemicals and materials with alternatives that are equally hazardous or maybe even worse than what we're trying to replace, or that we are shifting the burden too much in any other direction. But at its heart or its core, it's really about embracing proactive designs rather than a reaction to regulation, for example. So it encourages to choosing alternatives and assessing these more fully, preferably alternatives that are confirmed kind of lower hazard and optimized across the life cycle. And this is making choices that are more long term and about future proofing your business in the long run, because you know that you're making decisions that will be viable for years ahead. So SSbD really brings out and helps to structure a more organized way of handling trade-offs in safety and sustainability and support decision making in the innovation of chemicals and materials. I'm sure many of you have had considerations or thoughts of, if we're making this choice or this alternative that reduces climate impact, but we have maybe problems that deforestation in a sensitive area might drastically increase. You might consider, oh, we might be moving to this bio-based feedstock, but if it's toxic or it drastically increases the use of hazardous chemicals in the production and its emission, is it really better? And of course, there's also questions, maybe we're moving to this safer alternative, but the product lifespan drastically shortens and has a negative impact on the life cycle perspective. And SSbD is not a kind of magic fix to all of this, but it's more of a practical way of handling these trade-offs and the decisions that are made. On a more kind of formal explanation provided by the European Commission themselves, connected to the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, where the SSbD framework were first proposed. The framework aims then to steer innovation process in a transition toward clean and sustainable industries, to substitute and minimize the production and use of substances of concern in line with, but also beyond kind of regulatory obligations, and minimizing the impact on health, climate, and the environment during sourcing, production, use, and of life of chemicals, materials, and products. Now, the SSbD framework in itself was then tasked to the Joint Research Center to develop, and it's not really about creating something new. It's more about bridging disciplines in both safety and sustainability that developed over decades closer together and kind of integrating them into innovation from start in a more kind of joint decision making. So they really started with existing framework, and here the foundation are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but also other concepts like green chemistry, non-toxic environment, life cycle thinking, circular economy, etc. They map the safety and sustainability dimensions that exist in these frameworks and the method, tools, and indicators, and then try to kind of find this joint procedure and a set of criteria to evaluate chemicals and materials. And both of these documents were then published in 2022. And there have been a lot of activities going on since 2022. There are multiple stakeholder workshops and consultations, as well as boot camps. And I think the big kind of step between 2022 and 25 is really the practical implementation of the framework. So both by the Joint Research Center, but also the industry and academic community that try to apply this framework in various case studies and provide feedback. Now, this yielded a publication from JRC called the Methodological Guidance in 2024. That was really about clarifying kind of how you're supposed to think and adapt these assessments to different stages of innovation, and clarified a lot of questions and confusion that came up that may have arisen since the framework's kind of original publication. Now, this year, there's been a draft for a revised SSbD framework that's been under consultation, and the final version will be published more or less any day now, so by December or January. So having a quick look at the first version of the SSbD framework, I won't walk you through like all the concepts that were introduced. In the first, I will more talk about the kind of framework part. But the first version, I would say, was very focused on the assessment step and kind of the criteria and evaluation scoring and very much the scientific part, very straight on to that aspect. And it differs a bit from the revised framework. But they introduced these design principles that are gathered from green chemistry and green engineering. That should be the basis for setting different types of design indicators to evaluate your innovation. And it could also be the basis for screening assessment. But I will also say that it's kind of also supposed to guide your decision making in the innovation. So kind of help with handling these trade-offs. And these are then supposed to be integrated into the iterative stage gate process where you have an increasing technological readiness level. They also introduced 5 safety and sustainability assessment. There were 3 hazard steps and 2 sustainability steps. So the first one was to look at the intrinsic hazard of the chemical and material. So in the case of pharmaceuticals, this would be the API or the final drug. But you should also consider the chemicals that are used to produce this chemical material. So it's the human health and safety aspect during the production and processing phase. So a lot of focus on occupational health and safety. But you should also consider then the human health and the environmental aspect in the final application phase. So where is this chemical and material? Where will it be used and how can it affect the environment or the end user? So for the sustainability assessment, you had an environmental part, which is focused on life cycle assessment, and then the socioeconomic sustainability assessment, the social LCA. Now, this step 5 was the least developed in the first framework. I think it was about half a page. It didn't have a lot of content, and it was also not included in the official kind of recommendation from the European Commission. So that was kind of like the basis to begin with. As you can see, it looked a bit rigid, so I think it was kind of hard from this presentation to understand that it was a very iterative process where you adapt different TRLs. So that was really a basis for a lot of the feedback provided to the Joint Research Center. And these assessments also came with a traffic light system where you had science-based criteria that could guide you as if a chemical or material is not considered safe or need to be risk managed or safer. And for the sustainability was more if there's a trade-off that gets worse compared to what you're trying to replace, if there's no improvement or improvement for different indicators that you're evaluating. So the revised framework is now published more in the context of the competitiveness compass. So we can see that the framing of the SSbD framework is a bit different from when it was released in 2022. So they are trying to kind of tie it more closely together with the innovation landscape. So now they're describing it more that it's about integrating safety and sustainability from the earliest stages of innovation. So the SSbD framework can support a more resilient, competitive, and innovation-based, future-proof industrial ecosystem. So it's more aligned with the competitiveness compass this time around. So I think the kind of new additions or the big changes with the revised framework is that the GRC kind of described it as having to zoom out a bit and look at also the kind of mentality or almost philosophy in a sense of how you should view SSbD work. So they introduced these new SSbD principles that they describe as the new backbone of the framework. So you should think about, that the assessment should consider entire life cycle of the chemical and material, that this is a multidisciplinary approach. You need to engage value chain actors as well as internal company aspects. It's not like a one-person job. It's really, at its core, cross-disciplinary. The safety and sustainability aspects throughout the innovation is an iterative and tiered approach. It means that you need to adapt your assessment depending on available data and maturity of innovations. And this is closely tied then to the need for transparency and traceability of how you do your implementation. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to go around and tell the entire world what you're doing, but at least internally, there should be clear documentation on, what data have you based yourself on, what evaluation system, and what were the decisions made when you move on to like the next iteration of your SSbD assessment. A lot of the feedback was also on the need for more flexibility in the framework. So I think they also realized that they need to provide kind of some guidance and basis for how you can do that type of tailoring of your assessments. A more simple way of describing this, they're calling it the scoping analysis, the SSbD scenario, and the maturity of the SSbD. But in a way, it's kind of project management where you have an SSbD flair to your project management, where you set your scope and goals. So in the scoping analysis, you can more clearly define, what is this SSbD system that we're studying? Is it a chemical? Is it a material, process, and product? What in that system are we replacing or redesigning? Is it the molecule? Is it the process and the product? Which life cycle actors are relevant or should be engaged at this state? What type of innovation are we working on? Is it a minor improvement where we have good understanding of the technology, or should breakthrough innovation where we might have less data and less understanding of the alternative? What are the objectives for the safety and sustainability that we want to achieve? What are our goals? And what is the maturity of the innovation? Are we talking low, medium, high? Because this also indicates whether we have data or not. The outcome of the scoping analysis should then be the SSbD scenario that then is the basis for kind of how you tailor your safety and sustainability assessment, where you go from a simplified assessment and do iterations during the intermediate phase to a more kind of full SSbD assessment. They also introduced some clarification of the iterative nature of the SSbD implementation in the innovation process. So here now, instead of going straight to kind of the assessments or like the figure I showed you before, you have this kind of scoping analysis, the selection of the SSbD scenario, your safety sustainability assessments, the evaluation of the results, as well as documentation, and then you start over as you move along the innovation stage gate. There's also clarification of that the complexity of the assessment depends on where you are on the TRL level. So you start with the simplified, you move on to the intermediate and the full. When it comes to the green design principles, it's still the same one. So there's 8 of them, and there's still flexibility to kind of add your own ones. And you're encouraged to then concretize them for your field or sector with various types of indicators. And these should also then guide your decision making to kind of counter other things that are prioritizing innovation, like cost efficiency or performance. So you should try and strive for as much material efficiency as possible, minimize the use of hazardous chemicals and materials, prevent and avoid hazardous emission, reduce exposure to hazardous substances, design for energy efficiency, use renewable sources, and design for end of life, and consider the whole life cycle. When it comes to the safety and sustainability assessment, instead of having these 3 different hazard steps, they are now merged into one safety assessment. There's also some clarification that you can use physiochemical properties in early assessment to kind of help predict fate and behavior, and even some physical hazards or prediction of toxicology. This was not clear in the first version, and it can be quite important to have some exposure thinking early in innovation when you don't have a lot of data. The environmental sustainability assessment is quite similar to the first version, but they've added more support for this need for adaptation depending on where you are in innovation. But it's really the socioeconomic sustainability assessment that's been expanded quite a fair bit compared to the 2022 framework, addresses social fairness and competitive dimensions, and there's also some impact categories referenced. And there's also a stronger link to the competitiveness compass where you integrate, for example, critical raw materials more clearly. So when it comes to the safety assessment, it is the process by which the potential risk posed by chemicals and materials to human health and the environment throughout the life cycle are systematically evaluated. So this assessment then encompasses many chemical legislations, or could be, it depends on your needs, but it could be the more overarching, covering a lot of chemicals like REACH, or more specific ones like Seveso or occupational health and safety. Could also be the Industrial Emissions Directive that addresses the environment. And this type of safety assessment should also consider a potential transformation product. And now JRC have also included kind of a note that added that the value of the innovation should be taken into a holistic perspective in this stage. And they provide examples of biocides, but I would say pharmaceuticals go in this same area where they describe that some of these chemicals may have like a toxic effect, but they provide an important service. So like while at the same time you need them, you can also still strive for the safest alternative possible, optimizing the efficacy, minimizing exposure, and managing life cycle impact. They also explain that there is no really one size fits all and that the assessor must make several methodological choices at each step of the innovation process. So therefore, the transparency and traceability documenting your decisions are very important. They also have a section on suggesting how you can work with problem formulation in the beginning of your work as a basis for this tailoring. And it will depend on where you enter an innovation. Is it, if it's low, new, incremental, and all of this that I've mentioned. They also have a section on how you can characterize the chemical and material that's going to be assessed, which of course is very important for the exposure considerations. They also suggest that a hazard-based approach can be a straightforward starting point for the assessment, especially for existing chemicals on the market. So the hazard-based criteria are the same as in the previous framework, and this is to encourage that the most hazardous chemicals should be strived to be substituted or redesigned. So they could be chemicals that are classified as carcinogens or that can damage DNA or reproductive organs, or chemicals that are very persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. So this kind of H1 and H2 criterion are strongly connected to policy, like the EU Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, substances of very high concern in REACH, as well as the Eco Design Directive. So in this step, hazards are identified based on their inherent properties, and this could be using in silico models if you're early in innovation or have lack of data, to databases, safety data sheets, and regulatory classifications. Then you have the more classic exposure assessment, where you estimate the magnitude, frequency, duration, route of exposure to the chemical for humans and environment for the relevant exposure patterns and relevant health effects under either realistic or worst case scenarios. And this should also consider then the waste stage in the life cycle. So here you base yourself on the dose response descriptors that are used to derive the kind of no effect threshold for human health and environment. And then under the safety assessment, you use the risk characterization where you take this hazard and exposure values and compare against measured exposure, if that exists, or predicted exposure concentrations based on fate properties to kind of understand, is there a probability here of an adverse effect based on the likelihood of this exposure for relevant routes. And this safety assessment, again, needs to be tailored, and it can be done in an iterative way where you moved from a simplified approach or qualitative data to more quantitative data and criteria. They also have a section on, how you can handle uncertainties for these types of categories. When it comes to the environmental sustainability assessment, it is very similar to the first version, but they introduce some new kind of terminology and concepts for its adaptation to innovation. So they have the desired target, which is a voluntary kind of decision by either a team or a project manager or the SSbD practitioner to set the desired value that the innovator aims to achieve. For instance, a reduction of the resource use by 30% compared to the benchmark or status quo. Now, the proxy then is a reference values for key aspects of a generic chemical reaction. It could be mass balance, energy consumption, that can be built upon indicators from the green design principles. And this is then kind of feeds into a potential screening assessment where you might only work with a set of indicators for environmental performance. That excludes then the assessment of the whole impact. So this could be, for example, early energy or material requirements. For the benchmark, this is the average environmental performance of the representative chemical that you want to compare against. And this is where you start working with a simplified LCA, and they define it as a full LCA with assumptions and simplifications because some aspects are unknown. And the intermediate LCA is then this iterative modeling of the LCA going from simplified to full, where the full is then the product environmental footprint recommendation with 16 environmental impact categories. And then you have the kind of representative system that could be virtual, it could be real, and it's the system that you use for the comparative assessment or the initial starting point of the innovation. And it should represent the kind of current situation that you want to improve upon. And this information could come from literature or engagement with actors in the life cycle. And then you have different tiers and of course of this assessment depending on maturity of the innovation, and the framework provides some example and descriptions of how to consider this. When it comes to the sustainability evaluation system, it looks the same as in the first framework. So you have these 5 different kind of levels of scoring, where the 2 is whether you have a worsening of an impact category or basically no improvement, and then 3 levels of improvement against your then comparative system. They also note that these classes are then illustrative and they need to be defined considering the uncertainty of the assessment and the data. And you would then provide this score for the impact categories that you are evaluating. A new addition to the revised framework is also the evaluation and documentation to identify trade-offs and uncertainties. In the first version, they did propose a more strict kind of way of how you can visualize results, but I think they also realized that there needs to be more flexibility in how this evaluation and documentation is done. So they do suggest that this is aspects that should be considered in your documentations, such as the maturity of the innovation, of course, the results and the results from the assessment with this traffic light system, the uncertainty of the assessment or the data and the life cycle stages. So these were some of there are more kind of details in the framework, but these are kind of the big core aspects of the new framework, so to speak, and the big differences from the 2022 framework. And having all of these like long frameworks with a lot of hundreds of pages can feel a bit daunting. So I just wanted to show something concrete that we worked on at RISE, mainly from the first version of the framework. And this is an example of a workflow where we try to apply, a first SSbD iteration for a new process, where we sat together in this kind of scoping phase together in a cross-disciplinary team. We had, you could say you had a chemicals team and a process team, where the chemicals team used a screening tool going from thousands of chemicals, narrowing it down to 10 based on function and an early hazard screen. Then I provided a more SSbD-oriented safety score, and the chemist kind of did an early performance test where we could further narrow down this list of 10 to 2-3 more promising alternatives. And on the process end, you had a process simulator that started setting up system boundaries and mass balance that fed into an early kind of life cycle screening to identify environmental hotspots for these alternatives. And this could also then be fed into a techno-economical assessment or screening approach to estimate economic viability. And it was quite fun to work together as well. And even if it was just very simple screening approaches, together we could get a good overview of different pros and cons of this type of process design. I also just wanted to show a simplified kind of SSBD screen we worked on for textile formulation. So it's not really like pharmaceutical related, but we based ourselves on the first framework where you look at the kind of intrinsic hazard for chronic and acute human health and environmental hazards as well as physical hazard and some early kind of properties to indicate exposure. And this was then combined with an early LCA screening. So you can, and in this case, it was we could with in a fairly efficient way identify that while the PFAS formulation that we were replacing with a bio-based formulation, that the safety was definitely an improvement. There was still a need for risk management in occupational health and safety due to eye damage, but it was really the life cycle aspect that might be the main issue that could be improved upon going further. So with that said, what are the next steps then for the European Commission? They will provide a revision of their recommendation that will be published by the end of 2025 that puts the framework into a bigger kind of policy context. I would also like to mention that the in the European Chemicals Industry Action Plan, the EU will launch substitution and innovation hubs where they will mobilize funding on the EU horizon. And they do specifically say that they will integrate SSBD into these innovation hubs. And the next step for the Joint Research Center is that they will publish a revised guidance report in February 2026. So this provides more kind of like a hands-on examples of how you can apply the new framework into practice. And they will also have a stakeholder workshop in February 2026. And the next step for us in PHARMECO is that we are working in task 7.1 on tailoring the framework to the pharmaceutical sector. And mainly a lot of the focus here would be developing a practical guidance for the new environmental sustainability assessment. And that would build upon work that's been done in Transfarm on looking at how can SSBD be adapted to pharma. And Caroline Mormond has been one of the researchers involved in that work. So I think that's a perfect transition to hand over to you, Caroline, and say thank you for me.
Yes, well, thank you, Hannah. I'm really happy with that good introduction that you gave to the SSbD framework. So my talk will then mainly be about how it can be applied to pharma. I work at the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and the Environment, so that is a government institute, but we are partner of the Premier and Transfarm projects and also of the PHARMECO project. To set the scene why this may be important for pharmaceuticals to look at safety and sustainability in an integrated way, here you can see a very often used drug for mild depressions, fluoxetine, also known as Prozac, and I'm sure you've all heard of that. And when you look at the molecular formula, I think some of you may have already noticed, it contains that PFAS group. So this is indeed a PFAS substance. And of course, when you want to design a pharmaceutical, you have to take into account many traits of that pharmaceutical. And that CF3 group usually does have a function. So within the Premier project, which is also an IHI project that's almost finishing next year, we also discussed this. So we had that question, what is then that greener or more environmentally friendly API, especially if you look at the excretion of the API by the patient and its subsequent entering the aquatic environment? So we had that question at the beginning of the project, and that led to a lot of discussions, but also to a paper with greener pharmaceuticals for more sustainable healthcare, showing that you need certain criteria to decide when is an API, an active pharmaceutical ingredient, indeed greener. And these are these criteria. Please don't try and read them, but have a look at the publication if you're really interested. And the goal of these concepts really is to open up the dialogue between the environmental sector and the drug R&D experts, because these are usually really separated areas. And that's also when looking to improve sustainability, improve environmental safety of pharmaceuticals, It's not something that the environmental sector can dictate for the pharmaceutical sector. No, that needs to be something that's done in cooperation, and there needs to be discussion about that. And why is that? I mean, it's not like these are silos. So this is another publication from the PHARMECO project, and what you can see in that middle circle are the processes that happen in the patient. And those are the processes where the characteristics of the compound really determine how the API performs in the patient. So that is about specificity. How specific does a compound really target its goal that it's meant to target? The potency, but also the physicochemical properties, how lipophilic is it, or how hydrophobic is it, the stability in the patient, the ADME, the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion pattern, the efficacy of the drug, but also the patient safety, and that's all interconnected. And then if you add the environment into that mix, which is that wider block, then you can see that environmental characteristics like bioaccumulation, toxicity, mobility, persistence really also are linked to those characteristics of the compound that you need for an effective drug. So you can only design effective drug that also have less effects for the environment if you approach that in a holistic way. Now, that is something that we've been working on within the Transform project. So the next slides are all from the Transform project, mainly in two work packages. Work package 4, that's the Integrated Sustainability Assessment work package, led by Professor Atragas from the Radboud University, where a holistic framework was designed. Also designing lots of new methodologies for life cycle inventories and LCAs, and then now leading to an assessment framework where we can assess and also compare sustainability of pharmaceuticals. And within that work package, we also identified trade-offs between safety and sustainability, which will also be in my next slide. And then the work package 5 that I also want to mention, because I think that's also very applicable to the SSbD question, is the question, is there a business case for greener pharmaceutical products? And that's not purely an economic question. So what are the barriers and the incentives to actually get these greener products to the patients? And one of the barriers that we've seen is that we're missing a good system to decide whether or not something is greener, and how to define greener, how to define sustainability, what are the criteria, and what are the thresholds. Now, the word trade-offs has also been mentioned already by Nina. It's really important when looking towards the safety and sustainability by design framework to really understand that safety and sustainability do not always go hand in hand. It's not always that a certain mitigation measure or a certain decision is good for both. And that plays a really important role in the whole life cycle of pharmaceuticals. And I've got some examples in my next slides. The problem is that not all of these trade-offs are obvious or known. So they're often hidden or indirect, and a doctor making a decision on which pharmaceutical to prescribe in his room together with the patient, he may not be aware of these trade-offs. So these really need to be assessed in a very structural way to show what these trade-offs are. Well, and one example of a trade-off here is the new guideline on the chemistry of active substances that has been published by the European Medicines Agency, or at least this is a draft guideline replacing the current one. It's not final yet. So the text on top now, that's the text in the current guideline on the recovery and the reuse of substances. It says there, it's a bit small, but they can be reintroduced into the process when there are suitable specifications provided and met. In the new guideline, the paragraph on recovery is a lot longer, but it also states that the use of solvents should be avoided in the final manufacturing step, or the reuse of solvents actually. What that means is where currently, it's possible to reuse solvents in that final step, using that new guideline that will not be possible anymore. And that is a decision that is purely made for safety purposes, just to be 100% safe, or at least to try and be 100% safe, to prevent, for instance, nitrosamines or other impurities to be present in that last step. Even if you show that they're not, you cannot reuse that solvent anymore. And that is a sustainability issue because, for instance, for biologics, for 1 kilogram of product, usually more than 10,000 liters of solvent are used in that last step. And you can imagine that if that solvent then cannot be reused anymore, that's really an issue that not only makes the process a lot more expensive, but also a lot less sustainable. So that's a clear trade-off between safety and sustainability. Another trade-off is also the patient. So let's say that we're designing a better degradable pharmaceutical. That is probably also less stable in the body of the patient, unless you can really design that degradability to happen only in environmental matrices. And that lesser stability could mean that the patient needs to be dosed more often or higher, which is usually not in the best interest of the patient. Another example of a trade-off is going to a physiotherapy. So for instance, you have an issue with your knees or your muscles, and you can choose to either use a diclofenac gel, but we know from that gel that much of it is actually not taken up through the skin but washed off. And diclofenac is exceeding European quality standards in many monitoring locations in Europe. So that is something that you may want to prevent from happening. So then you could go to the physiotherapist. But there the safety aspects of preventing diclofenac entering the environment is being counteracted by sustainability aspects, because that physiotherapist needs to travel, the patient needs to travel, the room needs to be heated, you need materials in the room, etc. And there's a material use and energy use part of the environmental footprint that you really need to be able to weigh against each other. Now, setting the scene in that way that safety and sustainability do not always go hand in hand, but need to be assessed together. My next slides will be again more specific on the SSbD concept, and my next slides are all based on this article published by Pullman et al. In 2024. Well, and from that date you can already see that that does not include the latest SSbD framework, as it was just presented by Nina, but this is mainly focusing on the older framework. Where the SSbD framework has a stage gate model with distinct gates and steps, you also see that in the pharma development chain. So going from drug discovery to product development, and then in the end to the final product, there's many distinct phases, like the target selection, and then the hit selection and optimization, the lead selection and optimization. And all these phases, they have this DMTA cycle, which is design, test, make, test, analyze, and then go back to the design and make, test, analyze, and try again and try again and try again. I don't think there's any products on the market that went through this this arrow figure just all in one step without going back and trying again. And sometimes also when you're at the candidate selection, something happens in your analysis, you see it's not the correct candidate, and then you do have to go back a couple of steps and go and start all over. So this is quite similar to the stage gate model also of the SSbD framework, and I'll show you in the next picture, where this is the picture that we just saw, but then the steps from the SSbD framework put on top of these drug discovery and development phases. So in the first step of the SSbD framework, the SSbD assessment, that would be on the hazard assessment, that could happen in all these different phases. Then the next step of the SSbD framework, that's a different step because that's human and environmental safety, and you need more information there. And that can usually only be happening in those later phases, already at the product development. And the step 3, the human and environmental safety in the final application phase. Of course, the human safety as regarding the patient will be already early in the process, but the environmental safety is later in the process. And then that environmental sustainability assessment, that should be applicable to all these phases, where you can integrate that into your process and then see whether or not it works, and maybe go back a step to see whether an alternative performs better. Now, if you then apply the framework a bit more specifically to pharmaceuticals, we're mixing the R&D process with the SSbD framework and a life cycle. Then just looking at it from a different angle, there you can see that from the production to the synthesis and the formulation, the packaging and distribution. So this is really the physical process. So where the former slide was more the process in the development process, this is the physical process of the substance, beginning with production, the synthesis, towards distribution and sales, and then the use. That the different steps of the SSbD framework can also be applied here in this figure. So that all starts with the hazard assessment of the substance. If the substance is a real hazard, for instance, if it has carcinogenic properties, mutagenic properties, reproductive properties, CMR properties, whilst not meant to have them. Of course, if it's a hormone, it's meant to have endocrine disrupting properties. But if it's not meant to have that, it's a CMR compound, and that is usually also not wished for a pharmaceutical. So those will be getting the red flag and not designed further. So that's where the SSbD framework and the drug R&D framework really obviously go hand in hand. In the other steps, the step 2, human and environmental safety in production and processing, of course, that's part of that first part of the life cycle. Human and environmental safety in the final application, that's part of the right-hand side of that life cycle. And the environmental sustainability assessment, including, for instance, the carbon footprints and the LCAs, that applies to that whole life cycle. Now, looking at this from step to step, the step 1, the hazard assessment, the question, of course, is what type of input data do you need and what does it apply to? Well, in this case, you don't look just at the active pharmaceutical ingredients. You also look at the excipients and all ingredients needed. The type of input data in this phase would mostly be the molecular structure, because in the beginning of that step, of that design step, you don't have to, you don't have physical amounts of a compound yet. So when you're predicting it, that will probably be virtual in silico calculations that you do. Now, the SSbD endpoints of hazards for the patient or hazards for humans, they are already in the R&D, because the patient, the hazard that it could do to mammals, to patients, is already researched. The hazards to the environment are not yet part of the drug R&D process, but it should be part of the hazard assessment within SSbD. So that's a new process to the R&D phase that then could be added. And the relevant R&D phase is really the part in the beginning, the hit to candidate selection, and then for the excipients, they come into play in the product development stage. Now, the next step is the human health and safety aspects in the production and processing phase. So there, we're not talking about human health aspects for the patient, we're talking about human health aspects for the factory workers. So that's the occupational safety in all types of factories, because there's a different line of factories, from production of the intermittent products to the APIs to the final packaging round. The input data, the type of input data that is necessary for the SSbD framework there is the data on the effects and the exposure during production and processing. So that's, again, safety data. And what's already known from the R&D phase are the reaction and solvent guides for the synthesis route selection. What would be new to the R&D phase are the occupational risks during production and processing. And the relevant R&D phase here would mostly be the synthesis route selection and upscaling, because that is where all that information comes together. The third step is the human health and environmental aspects in the final application phase. So that is the use of the product by the patients. And there the type of input data needed are the data on the effects and exposure during the use, but also after excretion. So that's the waste stage after the patient has taken the medicine. And like I also said for the hazard, the SSbD endpoint that's already in the R&D would be the patient safety. The environmental risk assessment is not really part of the R&D. That's only performed late in the development stages, just before marketing authorization. New to the R&D would be the human health through the environment. So then it's not the patient health, but it's the human health of everybody around the patient, everybody drinking water or eating fish that may have pharmaceuticals in them, being exposed to antimicrobial resistance, etc. This is a risk-based approach, so it's about safety that depends not only on the hazards or the effects. That was step one, but here you also look at what's the exposure and is there actually a safety risk. So here the relevant R&D phase would be the dose defining stage, because the dose will dictate how much a patient takes and thus also how much a patient will excrete. Now the final step, at least in my part of this presentation, because the step 5 wasn't that much developed when developing this concept. Step 4 is the environmental sustainability assessment, and those are the impacts related to the chemical or material along the entire life cycle, regarding its toxicity, but also the effects on climate change, pollution, and resources. And the type of input data there are the type of input data that are generally needed for LCAs, like the data on the materials and the material use, the type of materials, the energy consumption, the waste generation, not just via the excretion of the patient, but also during the production process, emissions, etc. And this is not yet covered in the R&D phase. Now there are industry companies that perform LCAs to improve their processes, of course, but it's not a formal step in the R&D. So new to the R&D phase would be to perform these LCAs already in early stages of the development. In the early stages, you can only do simplified LCAs, like Nina also said, because the data for a full LCA simply isn't there yet. And then when data becomes available, the complexity of the LCA can also increase. Now, if we really look at the pharmaceutical use or the pharmaceutical framework, can we then apply the SSbD framework as it is now, as the real JRC SSbD framework, to the pharmaceuticals? And my answer would be that can only be applied partly. When you want to compare medicinal treatment, and that's also what the JRC framework says, you compare it against the benchmark substance. That means that you're already beyond the design phase of a new substance. So in this case, we propose that we're talking about a safe and sustainable by comparison framework that would build upon the SSbD framework, but that's different. So that is for pharmaceuticals that are already, for instance, on the market, where you also want to compare the safety and the sustainability and also weigh these different aspects. The safe and sustainable by design framework itself is not yet that much applicable to the pharmaceutical framework, because the data that you need for the SSbD framework according to the JRC framework, that's a lot of data, and that's simply not available in the design phase. It's only available for a safe and sustainable by comparison framework. And of course, that safe and sustainable by comparison has a strong link with the alternatives assessment framework, which is a terminology that's used in the USA and Canada a bit more. So summarizing that, within the scope of the JRC SSbD framework would be the design of new drug substances or the redesign of existing drug substances. Only the data needed to actually perform an SSbD assessment isn't there. So you really need a simplified SSbD framework there that is tailored to that really minimal information that you have in the beginning, probably just to flag the compounds, the red flags that you really don't want to further develop. And then what we can do is rename, for pharmaceuticals at least, that SSbD framework into an SSbC framework, where you can make comparisons between pharmaceutical products and then choose the one that is the most safe and the most sustainable to, for instance, procure, so put in procurement policies or put in guidelines and prescribe to the patient. But then moving further, so then, we have these healthcare professionals. They ask us, which ones should we prescribe? Can you tell us which one is the better one? And then the issue is that we still have a lack of data. We have a lot more data than at the design phase of pharmaceuticals. But for instance, the ecotox data, they are only available for a select set of pharmaceuticals and not for those that were authorized before 2006. We don't have harmonized methods yet on how to compare, for instance, the ecotox with carbon footprints. And also some parts of that environmental footprint, they are dynamic. So if you look, for instance, at the energy mix, which is part of the LCA, and production would move from Asia to Europe, then that environmental footprint also changes. And how do you deal with that in a sustainability assessment framework? And the example I just gave also shows these components are global. The healthcare system is really complex. If you pull a string in the left-hand corner, a ball will start rolling in the right-hand corner. So of course the question is then, what can we do? And we're now working on an assessment system also for the Dutch Ministry of Health, looking for criteria that are on the wish list of stakeholders, because the stakeholders that perform the procurement or the guideline writing, or all these people that want to take sustainability and safety into consideration, they have their wish list. Some things are important in their view, some things are less important. For hospitals, for instance, carbon footprints are really important, but we also see that for doctors, often the pollution aspects are really important. So stakeholders do have their own wish lists. But you also need criteria that distinguish between the products and that actually matter. If the outcome of a criterion would be the same for every product, you don't need to look for that data because it will not make a difference. Or if a criterion, the outcome of that would differ a lot between the products, but in the total sustainability score, it doesn't matter at all, it's just 0.01% of the total, then of course you also don't need to put any effort into getting the data for that criterion. And then the third one is that, the data should in principle be known by and be available from the industry. So you need to combine these three demands for criteria, and then that block in the middle would be the criteria that would apply to all three. And like I said, for the SSbD work, you can work with little data when you don't have that much. You can also work with very detailed data. You can see that in the figure here, where in the left-hand side, you work with very detailed indicators where you have a high data need, but also less uncertainty. And more to the right-hand side, you will have less data need. You work with proxies. For instance, that's what you could do in the early stages of drug R&D for your SSbD questions. But the uncertainty is also a lot bigger. And then when you talk to doctors, when you want to design an assessment system, you want to know where in this figure should we be? Should we be more to the right? So we can make choices because we have, for at least for these proxies, we do have the information. Is it produced in the EU or not, for instance? But then the uncertainty is also really large. And is that still acceptable for these stakeholders? And I think that's also a question also within the Safe and Sustainability by Design framework that we really need to try and solve is how much uncertainty can we deal with? How much do we need to be of the red flags for the substances that we should not further develop in the beginning of the chain? And how certain should we be when comparing substances? Now, we had an international workshop with lots of representatives from many countries who already work on these different environmental sustainability assessment schemes, each in their own way, each using different methods, using different data demands, choosing different criteria. And what I've got on the slide here is the dot on the horizon that we defined during that workshop. And I think that's a nice way of ending this, is that we really need a scientifically sound environmental sustainability assessment system for pharmaceuticals. And environmental sustainability assessment contains the environmental risk assessment as well as the environmental or more sustainability assessment parts. That needs to have consensus from all stakeholders, and it needs to be tiered, robust, harmonized, and adaptable to different contexts, so flexible for the different users. And with that, I'd like to end my presentation.
Great. Thank you, Caroline and Nina, for your excellent insights on quite a big topic. I think, as we can see, there's still a lot of work to be done, but these insights and experience from previous projects really builds a foundation and asks some key questions that we can also take forward then into our upcoming work. So to end this session, we have a few key takeaways to keep in mind moving forwards. The first is that this generic, flexible SSbD framework that we currently have really requires sector-specific adaptation. The second point is that really a cross-disciplinary toolbox for early innovation or low TRLs needs to be developed. Emphasis here also on cross-disciplinary. We also need the education of multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary teams to ensure we have joint and improved decision-making while using SSbD. And we also need to emphasize this need for a holistic view in order to assess safety and sustainability aspects in parallel. So it's not only about the environment, and LCA is a part of it, but is not the single solution. And our last point here is that the current SSbD framework and system is aimed rather at alternatives assessment for products with high data availability. And we really need to develop a system for the design phase, which is based rather on systems with low data availability for now. So again, big thank you to our speakers. And we can move on to some Q&A. So yes, we do have some time restrictions. We do have 10 minutes left, if I'm not mistaken. So we can ask maybe 2 questions before we end the call, and for the rest, we will answer then via mail. So the first question that we have is for Nina. And it is, what if the representative chemical or product is not available or non-comparable because of a change in requirements?
Thank you for the question. I can mention that I come more from the safety point of view, so I might not be the best person to answer this specific question, but I think that that's one aspect that with the new framework is the introduction of the screening assessment, where you start with, simple values that are tonight connected to design principles. And then I think their kind of definition of the term reference or benchmark in their first methodological guidance is tied to the function. So I don't know if that's helpful, is that the reference should be like based on some similar function that the new technology is replacing. But I think that this will definitely, and I hope it will definitely addressed in the upcoming methodological guidance on how to handle, because I think that is a very common question on the lack of a reference or data for reference or that kind of comparability. So, and I think that's something we could explore as well in task 7.1 through different scenarios. So setting up scenarios for the pharmaceutical sector where this could be one case. So like, how do you approach this? Because I'm sure there will be cases that maybe fall out of scope then for the more kind of strict definition of an SSbD assessment, which in this case is, I mean, they do kind of put a lot of emphasis on this comparative system. So what are the cases that fall out of scope where you can't do a comparison to a system? So I would, I think, like have a look at for the methodological guidance and the updated guidance, because they did provide decision trees for the sustainability assessment in the first version of, what type of data do you have available and things like that, and how can you kind of, what system boundary should you work on? So I hope that they will expand upon the second version as they are introducing new concepts in this new framework. So then I think there might maybe be a more clear answer on how to handle that.
Thank you, Nina. I have then one more question perhaps that we can still fit into the session, and that's for Caroline. This question is, can and should all pharmaceuticals be assessed in the same way? Many classes have a mode of action that automatically has an environmental effect. Examples are anti-cancer drugs, often cytotoxic, or antibiotics that lead to antimicrobial resistance.
I think the answer is already in the question. Of course, the answer is no. So you really need to look at things in a holistic way. And like I already said, if you look at CMR properties of pharmaceutical, and it's a hormone meant to treat in a hormonal mode of action, then of course it's reprotoxic. That doesn't mean that it's a red flag for the safety assessment, and it should not be developed any further because it's meant to be reprotoxic. On the other hand, if you develop an antibiotic and that antibiotic is reprotoxic, of course, that will usually already be something that is filtered out in that design phase and not be an issue. But that, that could be a CMR hazard thing that then is also part of the safe and sustainable by design concept. So I think, no, the pharmaceuticals cannot be assessed all in the same way, just like also the efficacy and safety aspects are also not assessed in the same way. You expect a lot, you can accept a lot more side effects for a drug treating cancer. For instance, you will accept a headache as a side effect there, but a drug treating headaches, of course, you will not accept a headache as a side effect or any other larger side effects. So that this should also always be looked at for each pharmaceutical separately.
Thank you, Caroline. All right, I think we have time to squeeze in perhaps one more question before our time runs out. The last one is, can product labeling be used to use consumer power to drive change in the context of SSbD? Are we that far yet?
I think it would be very hard to have a kind of generic SSbD label, at least, since now when within this revised framework they introduce so much flexibility in how you approach this that I find it hard that you could have some type of labeling in a sense. I think there's potential when it comes to kind of the hazard-based criteria, because they're quite I mean, they're tied to policy and they're based on hazard properties, for example, that I guess you could have some type of labeling if you have a a product where you know, at least like it's, let's say a cosmetic or something, or a chemical product that at least where you know the ingredients, maybe you could have a simpler kind of assessment method where you look at, are there any chemicals that are classified or according to this hazard kind of gradient. But I think it would be very difficult because there's so much flexibility introduced in a new framework on how you work with this question. So it's a good question. I'm not sure how. I think educating consumers could be one way about asking questions around safety and sustainability. Could be a start, but it's a tough one.
I think for pharmaceuticals, we're not really talking about consumers, right? We're talking about patients. There's not always that much of a choice whether or not you want treatment. And discussions about product labeling have been going on for a long time, especially also in the Netherlands. But if you would use the CLP, the hazard classification, product labeling, for instance, then on a hormone you would have that pictogram of that dead fish, which will affect compliance of patients to their pharmaceutical treatment. And that's really something that you don't want. You want the patient to take the pharmaceuticals that they need and to use them in a good way and comply with the once per day or 3 times per day and finish their treatment also. So yeah, the labeling will also then need lots of explanation, and I don't think that's possible in this case.
Great. Thank you very much for your answers and for the questions to the round. I think we'll close it here, but if you have any additional questions, please reach out to myself or our speakers. We'll be happy to answer them as well via email. So thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.